That morning, the Los Angeles sky was unusually clear, but Silas Everhart's heart churned with bitter calculations. In a luxurious beachfront venue, designed specifically for the wedding of one of America's most powerful tech billionaires, every flower was meticulously arranged. Every white ribbon fluttered in the breeze as if to flaunt the perfection Silas had always yearned for, or more precisely, for Sarah to see with her own eyes everything she had lost. Silas stood amid that opulence, hands in the pockets of his expensive suit, his cold gaze sweeping across the crowd of celebrity guests. No one knew that behind that charming smile was a meticulously crafted plan for revenge. He didn't just want to marry Victoria, a young, sexy, and social media famous model. He wanted to turn his wedding day into a stage for a spectacular humiliation. He wanted Sarah, the woman who had left him 6 years ago, to feel small, regretful, and broken as she faced his victory. "She'll come, won't she?" Victoria asked as she received her final touch of makeup in a lavish private room. Silas nodded, unable to hide his smug satisfaction. He had personally sent the invitation, along with a cryptic message, "Come witness a wedding you never dreamed of." Sarah had once been everything to Silas, his first love, his companion during the days when he had nothing. But it was she who, in the midst of his struggles during the early days of his startup, had left without a word. That wound, no matter how much time passed, remained lodged deep like a thorn that couldn't be pulled out. And today, he wanted to rip that thorn out by making her witness his perfection, the man who had risen to the top without needing her by his side. Music began to play. The wedding ceremony started. Flashes from cameras lit up the room, capturing every dazzling moment of the bride stepping out in a shimmering white gown like crystal. Guests applauded. Admiring whispers spread across the room. Silas held Victoria's hand and stepped onto the altar, bathed in warm golden light. His lips curled in a proud, cold smile. Then the grand doors at the back of the hall slowly opened. All eyes turned toward them. Silas froze. The air turned to ice. Victoria gripped his hand tightly, but Silas could feel nothing. His eyes locked onto the boys. Every feature on their faces mirrored his past. Deep eyes, lightly curled brown hair, a high nose bridge, and a smile. Half shy, half confident, it all tore through his mind. Sarah appeared, in a simple yet elegant deep blue dress. Her face no longer bore the naivety of youth, but rather the calm and firmness of a woman who had seen life. Yet no one noticed her as much as the 3 boys walking beside her. 3 boys around 5 or 6 years old, dressed neatly in black suits, walking in unison and looking eerily like Silas. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes meeting Silas's. No greeting, no excessive expression. She just stood there, calmly, looking straight at him. Then she gently placed her hand on one of the boys' shoulders and said, "Silas, these are your sons." Victoria released Silas's hand and stepped back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests even turned their phones to record the shocking scene. Silas remained frozen, lips moving but unable to form words. Every word Sarah spoke was like a dagger piercing the arrogant armor he had built over the years. "No way," he finally whispered. Sarah nodded. "They look like you. I couldn't hide them forever." Victoria turned and walked away, eyes brimming with tears, her hurried footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The wedding descended into chaos. Cameras stopped flashing. The music fell silent. Only Silas remained, and the 3 boys stared at him, not with resentment, but with curiosity, unfamiliarity, and a hint of innocence. Silas lowered his head. In that moment, all the fame, the fortune, the applause, suddenly meant nothing. For 6 years, he had thought he had won, but now, before him stood 3 lives he never knew existed. 3 children of his own flesh and blood, who had grown up without him. The wedding never truly began, but another story had officially opened. A story Silas could neither control nor orchestrate, like the lines of code he once wrote in his tech world. It was a story of mistakes, of lost years, and of a fragile chance at redemption, quietly knocking on the frozen door of his heart. The air in the wedding hall thickened, as if someone had just pulled back the curtain of truth, leaving behind stunned expressions and mouths agape from the unexpected shock. Silas stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, his eyes locked on the three boys who had just entered with Sarah. All three wore identical little suits, ties neatly adjusted to perfection. But what shocked everyone wasn't their tidiness. It was their faces. Three small, innocent faces, bearing features far too familiar. Deep eyes, thick eyebrows, straight noses, lightly curled dark brown hair, all seemingly copied from Silas Everhart himself. Whispers spread like waves, echoing into every corner of the lavishly decorated room. Some guests began pulling out their phones, not to photograph the bride as initially planned, but to record the unbelievable moment unfolding before their eyes. Victoria, still standing beside Silas, gripped her bouquet so tightly that her fingers turned white. She turned to look at Silas, as if waiting for an explanation, but he remained motionless as if time itself had stopped. Sarah took another step forward, standing tall, her face steady and unshaken. She looked at Silas with calm eyes. No blame, no anger, only an oddly peaceful expression. One hand rested on the shoulder of the boy in the middle, the other signaling the two beside him to step forward. Then, in a voice soft but clear amid the suffocating silence, she spoke. "These are your sons." That sentence struck like lightning across the sky. Everything in Silas's mind turned upside down. He felt as though someone had ripped the rug out from under his feet, sending him free-falling into the abyss of memories and unanswered questions. He stammered, "That's not possible." Sarah didn't respond. She simply looked at him in silence, as if allowing him to search for the answer within his own heart. Victoria, unable to bear it any longer, took a step back, her eyes shifting dazedly from the three children to Silas. As if she couldn't believe what she was witnessing, a guest in the crowd blurted out, "My God, they really do look like him." Chaos began to spread. Some people stood and left, while others rushed to capture the conversation that had just taken place. The sound in the room turned into a mess of astonishment, curiosity, and judgmental murmurs. Silas still stood there, eyes glued to the three boys. Each glance, each tight-lipped smile, each puzzled frown. They all mirrored fragments of a past he had never known. For the past 6 years, he had lived in the spotlight, in success, in fleeting, unbound relationships. He believed he had left everything behind, including Sarah. But now, that past had returned. Not in a letter, not in a message, but in flesh and blood. These three children were his flesh and blood, the truth no technology could encrypt or conceal. Victoria let her bouquet fall, white petals landing silently on the floor in painful surrender. She quickly walked out of the aisle without looking back. The train of her wedding dress dragged behind her like the final glimmer of a promise left unspoken. She didn't scream, didn't confront. Her shoulders trembled from rage, from hurt, from the betrayal of the man she was about to call her husband. Sarah bent down to adjust the collar of the boy on the right, whispering something that made him nod slightly. The three children, though young, seemed to sense the tension in the room. They didn't cry, nor did they appear afraid. They simply looked at Silas with eyes both curious and unfamiliar, as if meeting a famous person they had only heard about. Silas finally took a step forward. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse, the words refusing to form. He raised a hand to his mouth, eyes burning. Never in his life had he been pushed into a situation he couldn't control. Until now. Sarah stepped back, taking her children by the hand. "I just wanted you to know," she said, her eyes still holding that same calm. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding. I just thought it was time you knew the truth." Then she turned away, walking slowly out of the hall with the three children. Each step they took landed on Silas's heart like a silent but painful blow. He couldn't chase after them, couldn't call them back. All he could do was watch. his chest heavy with unanswerable questions. Why hadn't she told him sooner? Why did she leave? Why hadn't he known? Inside Silas, something collapsed. Not his reputation, not the ruined wedding, but the long-held belief that he had won. The truth stood before him in the form of 3 children, and he had missed 6 whole years of loving them as a real father. Now, all he had left was emptiness, along with Sarah's words echoing endlessly in his mind. "These are your sons." Silas sat motionless in the luxurious room behind the wedding hall, a space that was supposed to be reserved for the bride and groom to rest after the ceremony. But instead, that room now held only him, empty and cold like a golden box without a soul. Every echo from the wedding hall outside sliced through his chaotic mind like a blade. He could no longer clearly hear voices, nor could he truly feel any sound. Everything had shattered. The image of the 3 children with faces identical to his kept replaying in his mind, as if someone was projecting that scene on an endless loop. And then Sarah's eyes, calm, gentle, but infinitely deep, appeared like a reminder that he had lost something that could not be measured by any amount of wealth or shares. He couldn't let that truth be just a fleeting shock. He needed answers. He needed to face Sarah, not as an ex-husband or a successful man being challenged, but as a father. A father who had just learned he had missed 6 entire years. The next afternoon, Silas went to where Sarah was living. It wasn't a lavish mansion or a penthouse like the places he was used to, just a small house in the suburbs, with a white painted wooden fence, flower pots on the porch, and a little swing hanging in a corner of the yard. He slowly walked through the slightly open gate, heart heavy. He didn't know whether he would be welcomed or not, but he knew he couldn't wait another day. Sarah opened the door. She looked the same, simple, composed, and something about her was stronger than before. She looked at him, not surprised, as if she already knew he would come. "They're in the backyard," she said, without needing any explanation from him. Silas nodded and followed her. As he passed through the living room, he caught sight of framed pictures neatly hung on the wall. The 3 boys on their birthdays, at picnics, going to school, laughing on the grass. The more he looked, the more his heart ached. Not because of regret for what was lost, but because he realized he had never been part of those memories. In the yard, the 3 boys were playing a game of building a city out of plastic bricks. They sat around a train model, cheerfully debating where to place the next stop. When they saw their mother and a strange man appear, all 3 looked up. Their eyes met Silas's, not with fear, nor complete unfamiliarity, just a confused silence. Sarah walked closer and sat beside the boys. She gently touched the shoulder of the eldest and said, "Michael, this is your father." A wave of silence swept across the garden. Silas stood there, his heart nearly stopped. He didn't know what to say, whether to smile or cry. He only knew that the eyes of 3 children were looking at him, like a question, like a fateful meeting delayed far too long. Sarah led him into the kitchen. On the table, she placed a folder. Inside were 3 birth certificates: Michael Everhart, Thomas Everhart, Daniel Everhart. Father's name, Silas Everhart. She continued and placed a large envelope containing copies of medical records, immunization charts, and finally DNA test results. No reproach, no tears, just the truth, laid out clearly like a verdict that could not be appealed. Silas flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. The more he read, the more he felt like a man standing outside his own life. The milestones, the hardships, the days the children had fevers, the sleepless nights. He hadn't been there for any of it. For 6 years, while he was busy building an empire, Sarah had raised those 3 souls alone. "Why?" he finally asked, voice hoarse. Sarah looked at him, her gaze no longer cold, but filled with a gentle sorrow, as deep as the ocean. "Because back then, you only saw your own dream. There was no room for anyone else, and I couldn't let the children become a blemish in your perfect plan." Silas couldn't argue. He had been that kind of man. Cold, calculating, abandoning anything soft or fragile to chase some grand ideal. But now, that ideal was crumbling in his hands, as 3 flesh and blood sons were growing up without ever knowing their father's embrace. As he stood up to leave the house, Sarah held the hands of the 3 children and walked him to the gate. Michael gave a small wave. Thomas and Daniel stood close by their mother. Silas looked back at them. 4 people, a family he had never known existed for 6 years. The wooden gate closed behind him, but inside his heart, another door had just opened. A door leading to an entirely new chapter. And for the first time in his life, Silas Everhart felt he no longer knew where to go. No more stage lights, no more shareholders, no more million-dollar contracts. Only an emptiness wide open in his heart, where for 6 long years, fatherhood had been stolen. And now, he only wished for a chance to reclaim it. Silas returned to the small house with the white picket fence on an autumn morning, when the leaves had begun to change color and the breeze carried a gentle chill. In his hands was a bag of pastries and a few children's books he had carefully picked out from a little bookstore downtown. He wasn't sure if the kids would like them, but it was all he could think of at the moment. A way to start, however clumsy it might be. Sarah opened the door, her eyes surprised for a brief moment before softening. She didn't ask why he came, didn't blame him. She simply said gently, "They're playing in the backyard." Silas stepped inside, his heart pounding. In the yard, the 3 boys were sharing puzzle pieces, their faces radiant in the sunlight. Michael, the eldest, seemed calm and mature beyond his years. Thomas was quick and talkative, always asking questions, while Daniel, the youngest, silently observed everything around him. When they saw Silas, all 3 froze. Their eyes widened, reflecting a mix of curiosity and caution, as if trying to analyze whether the man standing before them was truly a part of their world. "Hello, boys," Silas spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "I brought some pastries and a few books. I don't know if you'll like them." Michael stepped forward, glanced at the bag, then looked up at Sarah. She gave a small nod. Michael turned to Silas and replied, I like cheesecake." A simple sentence, but to Silas, it was the first door beginning to open. He sat down on the grass, carefully dividing the pastries among the boys. That whole morning he didn't speak much, just listened to them talk about school, about how Thomas didn't like math, about Daniel's essay describing the neighbor's dog, and about Michael's upcoming baseball practice. Simple, ordinary stories. But to Silas, every word was a treasure. The following week, he came again. This time, he brought a robot assembly kit. He had been a software engineer before becoming the CEO of Tech Vision, and he thought maybe the kids would enjoy creating something from scattered parts. At first, Michael looked a little confused, but when Silas explained how to read the blueprint, the boys' eyes lit up. Thomas was excited to come up with names for the robot, and Daniel, still quiet, was the first to figure out how to make the robot move. "I used to do this every day," Silas said, still working on the joints. "I built my first software in an old warehouse, with just a beat-up laptop and a pile of cold coffee." "Really?" Thomas asked eagerly. "So you know how to code?" "I do," he smiled. "I even wrote the first lines of code for Tech Vision." That story seemed to form an invisible thread of connection. Michael began asking about programming, about basic algorithms. Daniel sat closer, occasionally pointing at the screen as Silas opened his laptop. Thomas, meanwhile, excitedly scribbled down function names with colored pens. From a stranger, Silas gradually became a familiar presence during the breezy afternoons on the porch. Sarah watched from a distance. She didn't intervene, nor did she stop it. She simply followed the careful steps Silas was taking into the lives of their children, one step at a time, without noise, without haste. One evening, Michael brought out his math workbook and asked, "Dad, can you help me with this problem?" That question was like a beam of light piercing into Silas's heart. He sat down beside his son, patiently explaining each step, each calculation, Thomas joined in with more questions. Daniel pulled up a chair beside them, just to watch him write the multiplication table. In the small kitchen, under the warm yellow light, the four of them sat together. A family that once seemed lost, now rediscovering broken pieces. Lunchtimes became a routine. Silas learned to make sandwiches the way Michael liked, learned that Thomas hated cucumbers, and that Daniel preferred his tomatoes on the side. He learned how to listen, how to laugh at silly yet heartfelt stories of childhood. No more million-dollar meetings, no more shareholders, no more dry statistics, only three boys with sparkling eyes. And him, a father slowly reclaiming the place he had once lost. One day, Daniel suddenly asked, "Will you leave again, Dad?" Silas was taken aback. A simple question, yet it carried so much insecurity. He sat down and pulled all three boys into his arms, and for the first time in his life, he felt tears fall. Not for lost assets or broken deals, but from the overwhelming love he felt for these small souls. "No," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, if you'll let me." Michael tightened his grip on his hand. Thomas leaned against his shoulder. Daniel said nothing, but didn't let go of his embrace. Silas knew his journey of redemption was only just beginning. But he also knew, if there was anything in this world worth starting over for, it was fatherhood. Victoria returned to Silas's mansion on a Saturday afternoon after several days of silence. She stood before the large wooden door, once familiar and dear, now strangely distant. Holding the engagement ring tightly in her hand, she hesitated for a moment before pressing the doorbell. The door opened, not by a butler or an assistant, but by Silas himself, dressed in a light sweater and simple jeans. His eyes were shadowed from sleepless nights, but his gaze was gentler and more distant than ever before. She stepped inside, observing everything around her. The abstract paintings that once hung in the living room had been replaced with children's drawings. One of them depicted three smiling boys, with a scrawled line below, "We love you, Dad." On the table, a homemade robot stood with its arms outstretched as if to welcome her. Victoria remained silent, swallowing hard. She no longer recognized the man she once thought she was about to marry. "Are you busy?" she asked softly. Silas shook his head. "The kids just went back to their moms. They finished their homework." Victoria pressed her lips together and stepped forward, placing the red velvet box on the table. She opened it, revealing the sparkling diamond ring that once symbolized a promised future. She didn't look at him, only at her hands clenched tightly together. "I came to return this," she said quietly. Silas sat down across from her. His gaze held no resistance, no intention of holding her back, only a quiet acceptance, as if he had already known this moment would come. "You're no longer the man I used to love," she continued, her voice steady but trembling. "I know. I saw it in your eyes. You've changed, and I don't blame you. Becoming a father has changed you." Silas gave a small nod, not denying it. He was no longer the cold man who had once plotted to humiliate his ex-wife in a lavish wedding. He was no longer the one obsessed with controlling everything through power and money. For 6 years, he thought he had won life's game, but when 3 sons stepped into his world, all those old values collapsed. Board meetings, shares, million-dollar handshakes. None of it was the center of his world anymore. "I once dreamed of a family with you," Victoria went on, looking into his eyes for the first time, where she saw weariness, but also a strange light, the light of a father living for something greater than himself. "But I know. I no longer belong in that picture." Silas didn't interrupt her. He simply took the ring, closed the box, and set it aside. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice deep and rough, for not realizing what truly mattered sooner. Victoria smiled, a sad, mature smile unlike any he'd ever seen on her before. "There's nothing to be sorry for. You're a good father, Silas. It's just, my love isn't enough to compete with fatherhood." She stood up and walked away like a passing breeze, leaving behind not resentment, but acceptance and release. That day, after Victoria left, Silas sat in his study, opened his laptop, and began drafting a new document. Not a contract, not an investment proposal, but the founding papers for a trust named the Everhart Legacy Trust. The trust would have 3 equal beneficiaries, Michael, Thomas, and Daniel, with decision-making rights transferred to them once they turned 18. It didn't stop there. Silas convened a meeting with TechVision's board of directors, presenting a proposal to allocate a portion of his personal shares in the company to his 3 sons. The decision faced fierce opposition from many board members, who argued that transferring assets this way would destabilize shareholder confidence and affect market trust. But Silas didn't back down. He sat upright, looked each person in the room in the eye, and said clearly, "You can take care of the company. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing to take care of my family." That statement wasn't an excuse. It was the declaration of a man who had come to understand the true value of success. Not the numbers on a stock exchange, but the bedtime hugs, the homework sessions, the laughter in the kitchen, and even the tears shed from knowing he had been absent for far too long. Silas knew he couldn't change the past, but he could use the rest of his life to protect the future of the 3 children he once didn't know existed. He didn't need Victoria to understand. He didn't expect the board to applaud. He only needed to see Michael's smile after finishing the first book Silas gave him, Thomas's pride when he successfully assembled a robot, and the sparkling eyes of Daniel sitting beside him typing simple lines of code. And for that, he was ready to face anything. Because this time, he wasn't fighting for a company, but for a family. The following months passed in a rare kind of peace. The small suburban house, once filled only with children's laughter, now echoed with Silas's warm voice, the sound of keyboard keys, the rattling of robot wheels on the floor, and the thump of a ball hitting the wall every late afternoon. A family life slowly took shape, not noisy, not perfect, but full in a sincere and warm way. Silas became a real father. He taught Michael how to write simple code, and together they created a small game that all 3 brothers enjoyed. Thomas loved baseball, and Silas learned to throw the ball, run bases, and cheer loudly from the stands every time the boy played for his school's little league team. Daniel, the quietest, would sit beside him for hours just to watch, but that gaze was the strongest bond of all. Unconditional trust, gentle and profound. Dinner became a sacred ritual. Each person shared something joyful from the day, something confusing, or something new they had learned. Silas listened with his whole presence. He no longer brought his phone to the dinner table, no longer interrupted by urgent calls from the board or investors. Every evening, after putting the children to bed, he sat by the window with Sarah, sipping tea in silence and watching the stars. These were moments he never thought he'd have, and now that he had them, he was afraid of losing them. Then the headaches began. At first they were fleeting, just a faint dizziness. He thought it was from overwork, from sleeplessness, due to excitement about his new life. But then the blurred vision lasted longer. He forgot familiar lines of code, confused file names, even once forgot to pick Thomas up from baseball practice. Sarah was the first to notice. She quietly observed, said nothing, only gently advised him to get checked. Silas agreed, not thinking much of it. But the day he held the MRI results in his hands, his entire world collapsed. A brain tumor, late stage, inoperable, only a few months left. He sat alone for a long time in the hospital parking lot. The lively sounds around him seemed to slip away, fading into the gray-white backdrop of reality. He had faced financial risks, media crises, betrayal from partners, but never had he felt so powerless. Illness didn't bargain. It gave no time to prepare, no choices. That night, he said nothing. He had dinner with his children as usual, listened to Daniel talk about a stray cat stuck in a tree, watched Michael present his first science project, and adjusted Thomas's baseball racket. He breathed in deeply the scent of the food, of his children's hair, of Sarah's freshly washed shirt, and tried to commit everything to memory. as if memory could transcend the boundaries of time. A few days later, he decided to tell Sarah the truth. The two sat across from each other in the living room after the kids had gone to bed. He held her hand, eyes fixed on the flickering candle on the table. "I don't have much time left," he said. Sarah didn't ask why or when. She simply stayed silent, then let the tears fall, without a sound, without panic, soaked in the deep, quiet pain of someone who once let go and now had to face loss once more. "We'll tell the kids," she whispered, "but not today. Let them have a few more days. That happiness is too fragile." In the days that followed, Silas lived with a mindfulness he'd never had before. He slowed down, paid attention to every little detail. How Michael furrowed his brows when focused, how Thomas tilted his head when laughing, how Daniel gently placed a hand on his back whenever he felt tired. He learned to listen even to unspoken words, to recognize love shown through silent actions. One night, while lying beside him, Thomas turned and asked, "Dad, what if one day I don't see you anymore?" Silas hugged the boy tightly, hiding the tear at the corner of his eye. "Then you'll still see me in every line of code you write, every ball you throw, every warm hug you give someone else." That answer wasn't meant to comfort. It was a painful, tender truth. He knew he couldn't stay long, but he could prepare for his absence. With love, with memories, with days of happiness, however brief, enough to leave a mark forever in the hearts of those he loved. And in that way, though destiny waits for no one, he could still leave a part of himself with them, with the family he had spent a lifetime trying to find again. Every morning, as the sun rose through the window of his study, Silas sat at his old wooden desk, beside a steaming cup of tea and a neatly stacked pile of leather-bound notebooks. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of pen meeting paper and the slow, steady breath of a man writing out the deepest parts of his soul. No more reports, no more lines of complex code, no more dense startup plans, only messages, distilled lessons from experience, and memories slowly turning into legacy. Silas wrote 3 notebooks, one for each of his sons. Each had a different cover, with colors and patterns reflecting each child's personality. Michael's was ocean blue, structured and orderly. Thomas's was deep red, energetic and full of life. Daniel's was a soft brown, simple and warm like the quiet gentleness of the boy himself. In each notebook, Silas recorded what he believed his children would need to carry with them through life. These weren't just pieces of advice, but fragments of memory. He wrote about the first time he saw the 3 boys walk into that wedding, the shock, the emotion, the regret. He wrote about the first time Michael asked about loops in programming, how Thomas's eyes lit up when he hit his first ball, or Daniel's quiet hug when he accidentally dropped his lunchbox. Every small memory was carefully documented, as if by writing them down, they would live forever, even if he no longer could. He wrote to Michael, "You are the guide. Don't fear responsibility, but never forget to be tender." To Thomas, "Sometimes your impulsiveness will make you fall, but your courage will help you rise faster than anyone." And to Daniel, "Your silence is a form of strength. Never think you are weak because you speak less." In the mornings, he wrote. In the afternoons, he lived fully. Though his health declined day by day, Silas was present for every part of his sons' lives. He spent hours at the science fair, where Michael showcased his self-coded smart home model. He cheered for Thomas during a tense soccer match that had the entire audience holding their breath. He joined Daniel at the school's robotics exhibition, patiently tightening screws, even as his vision blurred and his hands trembled. Each of the boys, in their own way, sensed the change in their father's face. The pale skin, the hollowed eyes, and sometimes the short breaths after a laugh. But none of them spoke of it. They chose to love him in a child's way, by making him laugh, telling stories before bed, drawing pictures for him, and always saving the best bite for him at dinner. One night, Michael quietly opened the study door and saw his father asleep at the desk, notebook open, with a half-written sentence. If one day you feel lost. He didn't wake him. He gently laid a blanket over his shoulders and closed the door. The next morning, he whispered with Thomas and Daniel in the garden corner. They began making a plan, not to save their father from death, for deep down, they knew fate had already spoken, but to help him live his final days to the fullest. Thomas hosted a mini robot tournament in the backyard, inviting friends to compete so their father could be the honorary judge. Daniel drew a graphite portrait of their father and placed it on the desk next to the notebooks. Michael wrote a small program installed on his father's tablet so that every morning upon turning it on, the screen would display, "Today you will smile because you have 3 sons who love you more than anything in the world." Silas recognized their efforts, and he knew, though they didn't say it aloud, his sons were preparing to move forward, not in sorrow, but in love. One time, he asked Sarah, "Do you think I've done enough?" She didn't answer immediately, then softly said, "No one knows what enough is, but you've done everything with your whole heart." And that is more than any child could ever hope for. On the last night of the month, Silas wrote the final page in each notebook. He didn't write much, just one message. "I love you. Wherever you are, whoever you become, I am always within you." He closed each one, tied a small string around it, and marked each with the handwritten name of its owner. Then he placed them into a private drawer, locked it, and gave the key to Sarah. Life doesn't allow us to choose where to begin. But Silas used his final days to write a closing chapter no one else could write for him. With love, with presence, with memory, and with 3 notebooks that would walk with his sons for the rest of their lives. Destiny is inescapable, but fatherly love, once it touches the soul, will remain forever. One October morning, the cold wind slipped through every crack in the doors, and the pale gray sky cast a melancholic stillness over everything. In the upstairs room of the small house, gentle light filtered through the curtains, falling on Silas's gaunt yet peaceful face. On the single bed by the window, he lay there, breath faint, eyes half closed, his expression calm and serene. Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand, the slender fingers growing colder with time. On the other side of the bed, Michael, Thomas, and Daniel gathered silently, their eyes brimming with tears, yet filled with courage. No one spoke aloud, but they all understood that the moment of farewell was drawing near. Silas slowly opened his eyes with difficulty but clarity. He looked at each of his sons, as if trying to memorize for the last time the faces of the 3 lives he loved more than anything. His eyes stopped first at Michael, the eldest, with serious eyes and hands always ready to help others. Then Thomas, enthusiastic, passionate, a little impulsive, but full of compassion. And finally Daniel, the quiet one, reserved yet deep and sensitive. "My sons." Silas's voice was barely a breeze, but enough for all 3 boys to lift their heads. "I'm proud of you, more than anything else in this world." Sarah leaned down, gently wiping the sweat from his forehead. Her voice choked but filled with love. "You stayed long enough for them to know what a father's love is. And I'll remind them forever." Silas smiled faintly. In his turbulent life, he had once stood at the peak of power, admired by millions. But never had he felt such peace. When he was no longer a billionaire, no longer a tech icon, but simply a father, lying among those he loved, holding them all in a heart that was slowly quieting. Michael gripped his hand tightly. "Don't be afraid, Dad. We'll take care of each other. I promise." Silas nodded weakly, his breath unsteady, but his eyes still radiant. He whispered his final words, soft as the wind passing by. "Live kindly and never forget to love." And then, like the day's final breeze, he departed, without pain, without burden. In the arms of his family, he left this world as a man who had fulfilled his life's mission. On the day of his funeral, a light rain fell. Sarah and the 3 boys stood by the grave, not in overwhelming grief, but with a reverent silence. They hadn't lost a father. They had simply seen him off to another realm, where love remained intact, only no longer in physical form. From that day on, Sarah didn't fall into silence, nor did she close her heart. She carried on, day by day, with the quiet strength Silas had once loved in her. She taught the children to keep learning, to keep living, and to keep loving their father in their own way, through actions, through kindness, and through a determination that never faltered. One afternoon, on the rooftop of the small house, Michael rolled out a whiteboard on the tiled floor. Thomas brought up an old laptop Silas had once used. Daniel carefully laid out the notebooks their father had left behind, opening to the page that read, "Start here." The three boys looked at each other, saying nothing more. They named the space Mitchell Brothers Lab, a simple name, but one that carried the full hearts of three sons continuing their father's unfinished dream. They began analyzing the code Silas had written for Tech Vision. Lines he once said had something special hidden just for you. In every character, every command, they saw their father, his intelligence, his humor, and the subtle messages he had tucked away like a never-ending game. Michael discovered a strange character string. Thomas said it might be a message. Daniel tried writing a decryption script. When they entered the correct line of code, a sentence appeared on the screen. "If you're reading this, it means I'm still here." They laughed through their tears. Every Saturday night, the Mitchell Brothers lab lights shone bright, not to soothe their longing, but to continue a stream of life. They didn't do it out of grief, but because they knew their father lived on in every effort, every idea, every dream carried forward. Sometimes, Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the laughter echoing from the rooftop. Her heart lightened as if touched by an old fragment of happiness. She knew that even though Silas was gone, what he left behind, not legacy or fame, but love, intellect, and faith, remained forever with them. And when the wind swept across the rooftop, carrying a few notebook pages fluttering into the dusk, one might hear a gentle voice whisper somewhere in the soul, "Love is greater than time, and I have never left you." The small house on the corner of the suburbs still stands. The white painted wooden gate creaks softly whenever the wind passes through. In the afternoons, laughter echoes from the rooftop, where the Mitchell Brothers lab continues to shine bright. Three growing children deciphering the pieces of legacy their father left behind. Under the sunset light, the pages of his notebooks are still opened, line by line, like an ongoing conversation that never truly ended. In the warm kitchen, Sarah brews tea. On the bookshelf sit three notebooks, now yellowed with age. They aren't locked away, nor placed behind glass, but always kept in the most visible spot, as if to remind every family member that they can reach out and touch the memories at any time. Each time one of them opens a notebook, they hear the gentle, wise, and loving voice of Silas again. A father who once lost everything, but reclaimed the most important thing with the rest of his life. Silas could not choose the past again, but if time could turn back, would you do things differently? If you were Sarah, would you be generous enough to forgive the one who once abandoned you? Could you stand in front of him, calm and without resentment, just to say a simple sentence, "These are your sons"? Would you have the courage to raise three children alone for 6 years? Hiding your tears, holding on to faith, and waiting for a day that was never promised? If you were Michael, Thomas, or Daniel, how would you look at the father who had never been there throughout your childhood? With resentment, fear, or curiosity, hope? Would you open your arms, or would you turn away and let the pain stay buried? Is love big enough to overcome the years of absence? And if you were Silas, facing a fateful choice between fame and family, what would you choose? He once chose power, once stepped over love to reach the top. But when he looked back, that summit was nothing more than a lonely peak, where no one truly stood beside him. 6 years, with no pictures on the wall, no laughter of children, no hug at the end of the day. Only when 3 little lives entered his world did he understand what fullness really meant. Not in a bank account, but in the heart. Silas chose family, not with words, but with action. By laying his hands on each page, writing a part of his soul for each child, by giving up million-dollar meetings to listen to his son's dream of building a rooftop lab, by standing up to an entire board of directors to protect the future of 3 children who bear his name. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a return to what he once lost, and then realized that very thing was his greatest accomplishment in life. Now the question no longer belongs to the characters in the story. It belongs to you. What would you choose if time could turn back? Would you forgive if the one who left you came back with nothing but a sincere heart? Would you be brave enough to love again, believe again, hope again? And if you are chasing something, money, fame, or an illusion of a perfect life, are you willing to pause, turn around, and see who's quietly standing behind you, waiting? Life always places crossroads before us. But sometimes, the real question isn't whether to turn left or right, but who are we leaving behind? Silas chose to return. And in his final days, he didn't die alone in a cold mansion, didn't quietly fade away among unsigned contracts. He passed in the arms of his family, hearing his children whisper, "Don't be afraid, Dad." Seeing his ex-wife, the one who endured it all, gently wipe the sweat from his brow. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was deeply human. An ending that makes us believe, if love is strong enough, it can transcend even time. So now, if it were you, what would you choose? Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think about forgiveness, about family, about the true value of life. Because sometimes, one person's story can touch the wounds, the dreams, or the hopes hidden within you. And if you find yourself in tears, don't worry. That just means you still have a heart that can be moved, that you still believe in love, in returning, and in the truth that we can always begin again if we are sincere enough. Share this video if you think someone out there needs a reminder too. Love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be on time. And don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next stories, pieces of ordinary life that touch the deepest part of the heart.